Yeah, welcome to this space. Massy Arts Society is an Indigenous-owned, Indigenous-led, generally a literary arts space. We're also a gallery. You wouldn't know it today. We're kind of in between exhibitions, but most days between 12 and 5, you can come into the space and indulge visual art as well. But in general, we are an Indigenous-led literary space prioritizing the work of racialized and over-excluded artists of all kinds. As an Indigenous-led space, one of the things that I like to think about is the way Massy Arts Society participates in telling stories that in some way interrupt the ongoing colonial story that is this city, this country. And so with that said, it bears reminding us that this place, this city, exists on the unsurrendered, unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we invite you to, tell whatever story you can tell that is an anti-colonial or decolonial story. In that spirit, Massy Arts is doing a lot of different things to express its solidarity with Palestine. And so if you are interested in finding ways on a local level to express solidarity, you can join our newsletter, and there's a whole bunch of information on there. In terms of housekeeping, y'all have already made yourselves at home pretty much, you're already eating the food. There's a washroom over there. We have refreshments, but also there's so many refreshments over there that I don't even need to mention those. Of course, there are books for sale. Are you guys glass half full or glass half empty people?
Glass half empty.
Yeah, okay. Cool, I knew somebody was gonna be on it. That's cool. So, you'll like this. I don't know. So so because you all are so keen and literary, we've already sold out of all the copies of Nimrods today. Okay. So you're glass half full people. That's good. I appreciate the optimism. And so if you're looking for a copy of the book post-event, you can just go to massybooks.com because this space is connected to the bookstore, so massybooks.com. Type in Nimrods, it'll be there. Other than that, I'm just going to hand the microphone over to these two wonderful authors. Thanks for being here. Have a great night.
I want to just jump into this event, but I have to offer some biographical information. Chris is truly one of the most humble people that I know, and he's going to wince this as I read this bio. But I would love to read it all the same, and it'll take a little bit of time. Kawika Guillermo is an award-winning author and third-generation Filipinx American whose family is primarily from Hawaii and Texas. He has lived in Portland, Las Vegas, Seattle, Gimhae, South Korea, Nanjing, China, Hong Kong, and Vancouver, Canada. Kawika publishes academic work under his patrilineal legal name, Christopher B. Patterson, where he works as an associate professor of the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia. His research and teaching focus on literature, video games, and new media through the lens of Asian North American studies, critical race theory, and queer theory. His first book, Transitive Cultures, Anglophone Literature of the Trans-Pacific, won the American Studies Association 2020 Shelley Fiskin Prize in Transnational American Studies, and his second, Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games, was a finalist for both the 2020 Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science Book Award, and the 2021 John Hope Franklin Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. His articles have appeared in Positions, American Literature, Cultural Studies, American Quarterly, and other venues. He has co-founded 2 educational podcasts. These are cool. New books in Asian American Studies and the Journal of Asian American Studies podcasts. And he is the co-editor of 2 anthologies forthcoming in 2024. And that is Trans-Pacific Undisciplined. That's coming out of the University of Washington Press, and Made in Asia / America, Why Video Games Were Never Really About Us. and that's from Duke University Press. Under his matrilineal name, Kawika Guillermo has published a debut novel entitled Stamped, an anti-travel novel. I'm getting used to these new glasses. You have to learn how to use them apparently.
I can read it for you.
Yeah.
Very fast.
No, we have to linger on these. These are amazing accomplishments. So Stamped, an anti-travel novel, and which won the 2020 Association for Asian American Studies Book Award for Creative Prose, and was adapted into a free-to-play video game, Stamped, an anti-travel game, in 2023. He followed up his follow-up speculative fiction novel, All Flowers Bloom, won the 2021 Reviewer's Choice Award for Best General Fiction Novel. Since 2020, he has been the managing editor of the online literary journal, Decalc Journal. Beside reading that bio that says a lot and doesn't really say much about the extraordinary generosity of this person that I'm sitting beside, there's this beautiful, I think, description of the book Nimrods that I also want to read. It's shorter than what I've just read, but I do really like it. Did you have a hand in writing this?
I think I wrote it.
Yeah, okay. And I was thinking, who else but Chris could read this? So this is a description of the book, and I think it might just help us set the mood a bit. In Nimrods, Kawika Guillermo chronicles the agonizing absurdities of being a newly minted professor and overtired father, hired to teach in a mysteriously named social justice institute. That's mysteriously named, is not. To teach in a social justice institute, while haunted by the inner ghosts of patriarchy, racial pessimism, and imperial arrogance. Charged with the personal is political mandate of feminist critique, Guillermo honestly and powerfully recounts his wayward path from being raised by two preachers' kids in a chaotic mixed-race family to his uncle's death from HIV-related illness, which helped prompt his parents' divorce and his mother's move to Las Vegas, to his many attempts to flee from American gender, racial, and religious norms by immigrating to South Korea, China, Hong Kong, and Canada. Through an often crass, cringey, and raw hybrid prose-poetic style, Guillermo reflects on anger, alcoholism, and suicidal ideation, traits that do not simply vanish after one is cast into the treacherous role of fatherhood or the dreaded role of professor. Guillermo's shameless mixture of auto theory, queer punk poetry, musical ekphrasis, haibun, academic misquotations, and bad dad jokes, so that's hard, presents a bold new take on the autobiography, the fake punk self-hurt anti-memoir. Just a perfect way of introducing the book that we'll be hearing from today and we'll be reading, we'll be talking about. I think I want to begin by asking you a fairly broad question, and that is taking apart that title, Nimrods, a fake punk self-hurt anti-memoir. I'm going to focus just on the anti-memoir part of it. Why is this book an anti-memoir, or what is your resistance to the memoir form, considering the experiences and questions that you're writing in the book?
Thank you, David. I just first want to say how good it is to have so many people here, to have so much support in Vancouver, just over the last 5 years since we moved here. It's just really nice to see so many of you. To begin with the title, I like talking about the whole I was just in an interview last week where they pointed out there's a lot of threes, like tripartite things. And I guess there is. And so they all kind of meld into each other though. Like fake punk is important because I'm thinking of like queer punk poetry from like zines to Kai Ching Tom to a lot of like even like student work that's inspired me. But fake punk is, I think, because punk could be also a very gatekeeping kind of culture. And I feel like in a memoir or when we tell our stories, there's some things that we just never say, like what we usually listen to in the car or something, you know, that can almost be more embarrassing than like telling somebody that you're queer, you know. Like sometimes, like if I told you what my top 5 bands on Spotify were, like that could be the most embarrassing thing I could tell you. And so I thought like just get right to the vulnerability, like immediately. Then what was the other one? Oh, self-hurt. That's the other. I think I was playing with self-help a bit, but I think we might talk about this more, the kind of raw emotions that I really wanted to find the appropriate kind of poetic form to express. And thinking a lot about suicidal ideation, thinking a lot about self-harm and the way that we've not really been able to approach these subjects or talk about them. And that for me, that was always really hard to deal with, the silencing that we have around these subjects. So I also wanted that to just kind of be on the surface. And anti-memoir, we'll talk about my my partner later, but she always like called me very anti. And my first novel, she gave the subtitle anti-travel novel. And so it was just something that kept reoccurring whenever we would talk about our creative work. But a lot of what I think about memoir also came from her. She was also a UBC professor, as a lot of you knew. But we both thought that memoir seemed to be like one of the most dangerous, I guess, kinds of very popular genres right now in literary worlds. Like if you don't count romance and sci-fi, like I think memoir is the top selling genre. And a lot of memoirs it comes from a really amazing tradition. If we think of like slave narratives, of like autobiography of Malcolm X, if we think of a lot of like Carlos Bulusan as writing memoir, writing life stories, there's such a powerful tradition there. At the same time, reading a lot of popular memoirs can feel, I guess if you're a scholar of what they're talking about especially, you just notice there's so much misinformation and so much imperial fidelity, I would call it, in the sense that there just seems to be like things you can get away with in memoir as far as like falsifying different countries and different peoples that you can't really get away with in like academic work or most creative nonfiction. And one example that I sometimes give is there was this memoir that I was reading about a year ago that depicts this other country, Cambodia, as a completely like patriarchal, anti-queer space. And the author themselves is American, queer, Cambodian American. But it just kind of gives a very strange account of like Phnom Penh is like, what a lot of the cities in that region are also like, as being just like totally anti-queer and totally patriarchal. And then there's moments in that memoir where they justify US bombing of Cambodia and basically say like they deserved it. And I'm like, this is after we know, Henry Kissinger and what Nixon were saying, we know the secret war, and all this information is out there. And we can have memoirs where this is just not there at all. You can just completely ignore it. And so I was always just wanted to find ways to share things about my life that didn't seem to incorporate well into a lot of other narratives I didn't really see out there. And I felt like it took a while, it took a long time to get there and to think of a style that seemed appropriate for the hardened and unusual realities that I wanted to tell.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. I wonder if now is a great time to give us a taste of the memoir. Hold on. line one, I guess, that you were thinking of.
Sure, yeah. I think everyone can hear me, maybe. Well, if we're on video, maybe I should speak to the microphone. Here, I'll take this. Hopefully I'll figure this out for myself. So I just wanted to read from the very beginning, including the dedication. And the poems are not really individual. They're kind of ordered through chapters. So they're somewhat long poems, I guess, but they're different. So I won't give too much context, but I'll just start from the dedication and then read the first chapter. In loving memory of Y-Dang Troeung, 1980 to 2022. You were my spirit, my ocean, my brick of a fist. Once more let us stroll another shore. Pray to the seas, please. Invocation. Can't write for shit these days. Fatherhood and COVID et al. This book began under the smothering covers of journal sheets. This book began when my brother and I asked each other if we missed our father and we both said the same word. This book began in 2016 when my father voted for the future president. This book began in 2017 when my son was born and I promised he would never meet his grandfather. This book began in early 2019 when I believed my father's death was a blink away and he'd never be around to read it. This book began huddled in quarantine, my father in a factory. This book began in the preoccupations of the professorial confession. This book began before I was born. This book began and will begin again. There's an epigram. The paternal law ought to be understood not as a deterministic divine will, but as a perpetual bumbler, preparing the ground for the insurrections against him. Judith Butler. I guess I was talking about myself, to bumble through that word. Line one, nice guys, read this last. I wake to my son, bleating, more goat than child. Atoms materialize in my breath and ribs. The calf's ear piercing whine. I catch myself thinking, I can't do this anymore. When will it end? It being fatherhood. My son bleats, I wake. When I learned I was going to be a father, I was in Hanoi quaffing bia hoi while perched atop a red plastic stool. My first thought was that an early reckless death was now forever off the table. I began to hope for a girl. Because my child is a boy, he's more likely to take after his father and take but never take an affirmative step to deal with his own shit, like being the mixed race, straight presenting, white passing, all perpetrating, son of an eye rolling WMAF. Someone else's baggage will forever be heavier than my son, who will come from a long line of men who die drunk and grasping at reflections of the throbbing high moon. I lift my son. I consider saying, I love you. Then, how meaningless is, I love you. He would say, I love you, incessantly while tossing toys, I love you. How I came to fear the phrase, I love you. Its intensity, its expectations, its constant being, I love you. Keeps you, holds you, would do anything to save you, I love you. And I want to shove that pacifier up your nose. Wasn't going for a laugh. Definitely feel comfortable laughing. Not even a real minority. Not really even marginalized. Marks of sin, trespass, sooner or later. But does he even count as a diversity hire? And does his inner child still cluster? How does it feel to be problematic? Hapa, traitor, bi, blacklisted. The success of my success story. Tolerate my ambiguous body. Analyze my Caucasian roots. Bear witness to my background. In case you didn't know, I'm a professor in an Institute for Social Justice. I make money teaching kids to hate their parents. It's actually true. During my first class, I asked students to write their family histories and explore the ways that power and resource grabbing has permitted them to attend this university. I do not join them. I walk the room, check my phone, try to memorize their names, mull over the library gardens, eye the clock tower monument to the pioneers, and glance at an oak bench upon which a committee has paid someone to carve the statements of refugees. The most surprising thing about coming to Canada was to see a person walking ahead of me and holding a door open until I could put my hand on it. Where I come from, people were taught to kill. W. Rwanda. When I moved to Vancouver, I thought that home was a safe place, a place of prosperity. But now I understand that home is home because of identity. M. South Sudan. Whenever I start to complain about university work, I think of my father and how he had to leave in the middle of his degree because someone decided to start a war. T. Croatia. While so many others came from such difficult circumstances, I had nothing to run from, nothing to escape. Chris, Canada. The Academy has taught me to isolate the past into weapons of my own making. Archive, text, stories of my family's migration from Ilocos Norte to Hawaii, their offspring's fornications with indigenous, Japanese, Korean, Cambodian, Black, and Haole people. Silence in the face of war, poverty, and white supremacy. Carve the past into weapons I keep in a box to pull from whenever I need. A past of seeds caught in trade winds, but there is another past, not of seeds coming to root, but of ships coming to settle. The past of my white grandfather, who preached from a pulpit that divorce and homosexuality were certain routes to hell. The past of my uncle, who retreated from his father's insanity and died in Los Angeles of HIV-related illness. No. One in the family talked about him, and if asked, they would get choked up or pretend to. Sometimes the past is not an archive, it's the white uncle asking you at your own grandmother's funeral how you learned to speak English. An ode of debts owed to myself. If a brown man falls in a white forest of evergreens, does anyone feel appalled? To whom do I owe the power behind my voice, what strength I have become? Hide your heart until it grumbles like a thunder that pounds your body into the storm. Armor lurks below death's door. We work the floor. Wake work. The work of dwelling in the wake of plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of the everyday of Black imminent and imminent death. Ode work. The work of giving honor and respect in a way that also dismantles that honor. I do not know how to speak of the dead without the song of odes. I cannot speak of elders without counting the ode. I cannot reach the path without anodes, without working to strip out every piece of rusted ore. My son will live in the ode, accounting for uncounted broken trees and counted plantation cicadas from Ilocos, who counted the sugar that fed the counted migrants of the Dust Bowl plains, rescued by the uncounted airplanes, that counted 7.6 million tons of explosives, dropped not counting the uncounted, genocide and its uncounted aftermath, where uncounted relies on all the isms that will guide him to count whether or not he is a man, whether he counts in the way others count. Someone said each kid eliminates one book. What did I sacrifice for you? What did you write for me? What can storms build out of the trees they fall? How much slack can we give to what rides at the line's end? Can new grammar overcome the violence of abstraction? There is a lot to mourn, to warm, to warn, and work to be done. Thank you.
It's amazing hearing it in your voice, Chris. As you mentioned, we're going to talk later about the extraordinary memoir by Y-Dang Troeung. In that book, and we'll get to it again a little later, there is a line, and it's attributed, a comment attributed to a friend, Anita, I believe. And the line is this: they say the academy, they say the academy kills your maternal instinct. She means our need when it comes to our histories to reach beyond study and research, to care, to honor, to love, to mother, to sister, to cousin. If this is a rendering of the maternal instinct, and maybe it's not. What's interesting, it's structural, as I say. It's not linked to particular bodies. I'm very interested in fathering, which is omnipresent in this book. The hurt of fathering, the unending crisis of being a father. I feel it's a risk to ask this question. It's the most loose of the questions I think I'm going to ask you. But I guess I want to hear what the relationship of the fake punk self-hurt anti-memoir is to fatherhood.
I think I wrote the book kind of trying to figure that out. I started writing it with my son when we found out that my wife was pregnant, and I never wanted to be a parent, and I mean we wanted to at the time, but before then we had both kind of been like voted least likely to ever get married or have a kid and things like that, and so. And I think partly because of my own experience with my father, that I just didn't see a model that was, good to replicate, and not something that I had really, prepared for, like, ethically, I think. And I couldn't really work out a way out of that. It's strange, once you are granted some kind of instance of power, how the amount of anxiety that can bring. And to have a child is really to have a lot of power. You have power over an entire life, and so I think I've always been someone who always felt like power was out there on me, and which I think from my very first novel was always something I wrestled with, whether it's traveling in Asia and then realizing, oh, I have all this power that I've never had before, being marginalized from the US, and then suddenly people care what you think and like will give you jobs, things like that. And you can make money. And I wrote my first novel basically based on the anxiety of like having any kind of power and misusing it, reproducing it. And I think Nimrods is very much in that similar anxiety of trying to figure out, how to be the best kind of person and not having any real role models that you feel are adequate. But I feel like it also goes to this question, like my father he was somewhat matriarchal too in some ways, I guess, in the ways that he approached a lot of things out of love and care. And that was always great on one hand, but also very, very difficult because there was also so much religious kind of baggage with it. There was so much like, I love you, and if you don't do this, you'll go to hell, And I think having love without understanding or historical knowledge, he's white, and so not knowing what I was going through a lot of the time, growing up in like all white schools and things like that, you just have this limit to what like that kind of parenting can do, right? Without that knowledge or understanding, things can get...
In a track 2, it is the track 2 is entitled Re/con/sile. Reconcile. It's a powerful moment in your book. The track begins. This track Re/con/sile begins with the lines "fuck you and I love you," and "fuck you and I love you," and "fuck you and I love you," and over getting around a photograph that is, it's a disturbing photograph, necessary photograph.
Yeah, it looks like that.
Yeah, there we go.
Follow me on page 193 in your Bibles.
And it's kind of in the context, you've put us now in the context of July 2018. You're living in Vancouver, in closest proximity to your father for the first time in a long time, or really ever since you've become an adult?
Quite a while,
yeah.
like not long, like 5 years.
Okay, 5 years, yeah. And you're now with your wife and with his wife, with Y-Dang and your son, his grandson. You're taking him to tour the UBC. I'm struck by that ending, that effort to cultivate a closeness with your father, the very title of this track being Reconcile. And yet here, a certain type of, almost for me, almost like an alarm bell goes off that you so brilliantly kind of deal with. And that is what I would say is the reconciliatory pressure of the contemporary memoir. The sense that it will now be a relatively free or easy ending to hurt, to past or possibly ongoing problems in different stories, cycles of abuse. We all know what's problematic about the ideal that has now stuck to that word, reconciliation. And yet, it's the and yet that I wanna kind of ask about. We have, do we not, yearnings for new relations with the actors in our lives. We yearn for something else. I guess I want to ask, how are you thinking through this broken term that you present to us near the end of the book, reconcile?
Thank you. I mean, it kind of calls back to two different parts of the book. There's one where like reconciliation is just a con, I think is a line.
Yeah.
And then actually one of the lines I read, resilience or re-silence, and this is another thing the editors just kept changing it back. I'm like, no, it's not resilience, it's re-silence. Because you know, sometimes when someone tells you you're being resilient or you have so much resilience, sometimes it feels like they're just re-silencing you, or that you're becoming silent again is the resilience. And so I try to, play with those words without telling you exactly what I think I'm doing with them. Reconcile is one where just, if I had to plan it out, I would have a bunch of arrows pointing all over the place. Just look like one of those charts, and so recon, like reconnaissance. Con, reconciliation is just a con. Sile is like when rain siles down, crossly. It's kind of like if a knife is stabbing. So there's a kind of violent association with sile. So it's all those things kind of put together. And there's a moment in that chapter where my father, I think my father's had some alcohol, and I'm trying to keep him away from my son, so we walk around the campus, and we come across the reconciliation pole, the house totem there, and it's a really powerful image because it has, I can't remember exactly how many, but copper, 160,000 copper nails to represent every child who's died in residential schools that they knew at the time. And my father looks at it, and I explain it to him what it is, and he says, "Why do they call it the reconciliation pole? They should call this the genocide pole." And he was drinking and stuff, so I was very, do I really love this person right now for saying that? That's such a power, someone who has such conservative views in some ways has these other openings, and has lived in South Korea, lived in the UAE, really thrived living in the UAE, I should say. So he's just a very complex, strange person. And I was also trying to think about how this is the moment in the traditional memoir where you would expect reconciliation. And so I wanted to show this is what we're getting. It's not exactly hope, it's just here's the present, and all we can kind of do with the present is be with each other. And there's things that he still espouses and thinks of, and that I just try to understand. He was raised he's an American evangelical Christian. There's so much in that can, and whites, and but also was the only person in his family to marry outside whiteness. And just did a lot of strange things, and was rebelled against his family in a lot of his own ways. And so I just try to recognize that complexity. And I think one of the ways that you were thinking about my resisting academic work, which isn't really real academic work, or is it to say that academic work always does this, but I felt really comfortable putting my father in a villainous white male, cis white male category, like box, for like 10 years. Like that was a nice place for him to be for a decade. It was just, and that was great because I was in grad school, I was learning all, doing a lot of critical race theory and writing books and stuff, and yeah, it was great. Like and then I realized I was going to be a father, and I was like, crap, I can't really just put him there. Like he's contained, but I got to deal with it, and I got to open that box. And basically, he has to be a real person now. I can't just place him into this abstract category of all these things, because I also knew that's not what he is. And I feel like there is some room for a change. Like I know that me and my brother have pushed him to not go to the churches that he used to go to and things like that, at least not give money to them, and so even those very small things are at least like some kind of presence that he has.
Thank you, Chris. Well, now I'd love to turn to this beautiful book, Landbridge, Life in Fragments, by Y-Dang Troeung. This is, I know when I look back on my life, the co-release of these two books, written by two beautiful people, will be something that I'll just think about, and I'm still thinking about the ways in which these two memoirs are connected and yet so distinct. And so I feel in a certain way to every time I think about Landbridge, it feels beyond me to do justice to in even just gesture towards in thinking about this book. But I'd love to talk a little bit about it, and maybe in the context of some of the things we've been discussing. I'll read just a little bit about the book itself. Y-Dang was an extraordinary academic. I feel, should I read the?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Okay. I'm going to read two things. I'm going to read their work, Y-Dang's academic work, and then I'm going to also give you a description of Landbridge itself. Y-Dang Troeung was an assistant professor of English at the University of British Columbia. Her colleagues are here, friends and colleagues. She was an associate editor of the journal Canadian Literature, a quarterly of Criticism and Review, and a faculty affiliate of the Asian Canadian Studies and Migration program. Y-Dang researched and taught in the fields of transnational Asian literatures, critical refugee studies, trans-Pacific Cold War studies, and critical disability studies. Her work can be found in Canadian Literature, Brick, a literary magazine, Amerasian Journal, Amerasia Journal, and Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. From 2012 to 2018, she lived and worked in Hong Kong as an assistant professor at City University of Hong Kong. Y-Dang's publications include work in a variety of magazines that I've already mentioned, and guest edited a special journal issue, Refugee World-Making Canada and the Afterlives of the Vietnam War. Based on an art exhibit she co-curated at the Bofana Art Center in Phnom Penh. Her book, Refugee Life Worlds, An Afterlife of the Cold War in Cambodia, was posthumously won the 2023 American Studies Association Shelley Fishkin Prize in Transnational American Studies, and was a finalist for both the 2023 Prose Awards in Humanities and the BC and Yukon Book Prizes, and was named an outstanding academic title by Choice Magazine, the only book from Temple University Press to be named in 2003. Her family and collective memoir, entitled Landbridge, A Life in Fragments, was published in August 2023 with Knopf Canada, but was not eligible for major awards who do not recognize posthumous publications. A short film she wrote and co-directed based on her upbringing as a refugee, Easter Epic, will premiere in spring 2024. That's so excited too. Y-Dang passed away in fall 2022 of pancreatic cancer, surrounded in the warm glow of loved ones and friends. So there's also a really amazing description of her Landbridge, and I really must read this before maybe asking some questions. In 1980, Y-Dang Troeung and her family were among the last of the 60,000 refugees from Cambodia that the then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau pledged to relocate to Canada. As the final arrivals, their landing was widely documented in newspapers, with photographs of the PM shaking Y-Dang's father's hand, reaching out to pat baby Y-Dang's head. 40 years later, in her brilliant, astonishing book, Y-Dang returns to this moment and to many others before and after to explore the tension between that public narrative of happy arrival and the multiple, often hidden truths of what happened to the people in her family. In precise, beautiful prose, accompanied by moving black and white visuals, in precise, moving, beautiful prose accompanied by moving black and white visuals, Y-Dang weaves back and forth in time to tell stories about her parents and two brothers who lived through the Cambodian genocide, about the lives of her grandparents and extended family, about her own, oh my God. I was thinking,
It's the same person.
Yeah, it is the same person. I know, how incredibly rude to leave your ringer on. About the lives of her grandparents and extended family, about her own childhood in the refugee camps in rural Ontario, and eventually about her young son's illness and her own diagnosis with a terminal disease. Through it all, Y-Dang looks with bracing clarity at refugee existence, a refusal of gratitude, becoming a scholar of love. So maybe this is a chance for me just to return to that question I asked you at first, Chris, which is the word memoir doesn't appear on the cover of this book. It is sometimes out of convenience described as a memoir. But it is instead life in fragments. And I guess I want to ask what kind of, may I use the word life storying this book is, and how does it depart from the traditional memoir?
Thank you. Y-Dang was my wife. Sometimes I have to forget about it. We met in Hong Kong and moved to Vancouver together. I think one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about Landbridge here is because so much about Nimrods for me only makes sense sometimes when I talk about it through Nimrods or talk about Landbridge as well. I get them mixed up. Because we were both so invested in kind of doing memoir without doing memoir, or like being able to tell the stories we wanted to tell, and somehow find a way to do it outside of a lot of the genre expectations and audience expectations on memoir. And I think we both had very different answers to that question, but they both seem to rely a lot on fragmentation. And so we're both dealing with experimental styles, and we just had an amazing guest speaker last week, Karnita Mohammed, who came to our unit and spoke about experimental style and how experimental style initiates a kind of ethical quandary for the reader that most genre literature doesn't. Like if it's easy to read, you don't really you don't question your own values all that much, I guess, or your own approach. Whereas experimental work, which I guess is to say work that doesn't, that's not familiar, it comes to you like as a stranger, and you have to kind of figure out how you belong with that person. who you are in relation to that person. You know, we all have these different roles we play, and if we see someone we don't know what role we're in. And so it was, for me, it was this really brilliant way of kind of capturing a bit of what I think drew both Y-Dang and I to more experimental styles, was trying to think through, you know, what is an ethical way for her to re-narrate this history through her own lives and tell stories of her parents, tell stories of her friends that she grew up with, who entrusted stories of refugee survival, stories of genocide to her. You know, we are living through a genocide right now, and it's very apparent. There's so many kind of links between her book right now. The way that there's a genocide, but nobody wants to talk about it. And if you do talk about it, it's so bifurcated, right? And it's just in Cambodia, in retrospect, it's so much easier to talk about it, like 40, 50 years after. But as it's happening, she tries to bring us to that space when it's happening, to let us know, like, you know, nobody wanted refugees to come to Canada at the time. Like, we were very unpopular. There was, you know, complete silence around the word genocide, and still is in some cases, about using the word genocide to talk about that situation. And so there's just so much resonances, and she was just so aware of this could get misinterpreted, and it has, you know, and that memoir I mentioned to you before is about that too, and does a lot of that imperial reworking. So I've talked a bit about how my fragments try to do some of that work, make some of those links more apparent. And hers, a lot of it is through moving around with time. And so that her experience of cancer is interlinked with her experience of motherhood, with her parents suddenly being alone in the world and not having her mother losing almost all of her family in the genocide. And then her birth in a refugee camp, and then being used, her icon, then being used by the Canadian state to completely erase its own complicity with the Vietnam War and the bombing of Cambodia. And so she's trying to think of all that together. Like, those things are not very separable. Like, I think memoirs often tries to historicize it, to put it all back there. But when it's all present, you kind of have to deal with it. And as our speaker, Karneen Mohammed, was saying last week, that fragmentation, I think, puts the reader in a space where they have to really understand how they're approaching this. Like, what do I expect out of this? And I've seen some negative reviews of Landbridge, not many, but I never do this to my own work. But for something about Y-Dang's work, I will always look up reviews and try really hard not to respond to them. But the bad ones are always I expected something else. Like, I expected this book to be more of a history book, or I expected this book to kind of, I think a lot of them expect it to be a bit more patriotic about Canada, and it never is. You know, it doesn't give them what they want. And so to me, it just verifies that the book does what it was supposed to do, what she sought for it to do. But I also sometimes want to respond, and I try really hard not to. Yeah.
I mean, you've spoken so directly to two other questions I was going to ask you. One about the fragment as a writing unit and its work in this book, and the other thing is both the specificity of certain crucial historical experiences in the book, genocide, and the bombing of civilians, and its urgent applicability in this particular moment. So thank you for mentioning those, for taking us in that direction. I'll ask two really quick questions, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
or I can condense it down to one. But one thing, again, maybe I've mentioned this, I'll mention it again, what was beautiful, what remains beautiful, Chris, is the relationship that you had with Y-Dang, not only as soulmates, but practicing writers in the practice of producing works of art. And there was a kind of a question that I want to ask about co-imaginaries or co-imaginations, ways in which people can collaborate, and they're working on similar materials, and yet their work does not impose itself on the other. So I want to maybe just ask you just this broad question about the ways in which, or ask you the ways in which you nourished each other's work, and the ways in which maybe the work nevertheless remained apart and remained distinct.
Yeah, and I like that you put it through imagination, because we both had really wild and playful imaginations. I don't know if I have that as much these days, but when we met in Hong Kong, we're both, I'm mixed Asian, she's mixed Cambodian and or Khmer and Chinese, and so we could just both pass as a lot of things, and not that we ever encourage people, but we would show up somewhere and people would think that we were whatever local population of whatever place we were in, or they would offer oh, you're half Vietnamese, come have dinner with us or something, and so they'd often believe that we were brother and sister, and so they would be shocked if we just let them believe that, and then suddenly we're not. And so I think we had this kind of floating island to ourselves all the time, and we're just very playful with how we imagined the world and how we imagined each other, and so as writing partners, it was also perfect in some ways, because once we started to read a lot of each other's work, once we started to get each other's writing habits, we just fit into those roles. She was incredible at synonyms. She was better than any thesaurus, better than ChatGPT at finding synonyms. If I asked her what the best word, what's a word that's from the 90s, but it has this thing and that, and she just immediately tell you what it was. And so she just was very, very sharp in those ways. And as a writer, I kind of tend to overwrite and then edit the crap out of it for years or something until it becomes something I feel comfortable with, or is imperfect in the way I want it to be imperfect. But she was really a perfectionist. Every word had to be exactly perfect. Every sentence had to be perfect, which I think is why she took longer with her work, and her last book was published posthumously. But yeah, it encouraged me to think about collaboration. So you don't really see a lot of it, in academia and in books and monographs. I guess we wouldn't call it a monograph in that sense. Collaboratively published poetry books, we don't see that often, and I think we tended to think of it I was producing her work, in musical terms. I was her producer, and she was my producer for my work. And so we could get the rhythms going, we could mix it, and we'd have our own kind of background stamp on it in a way. But it's still, the author or the band's work, and we're just the person trying to make it make sense in a larger realm. With her work especially, it's so fragmented, and we often approached it, another strange metaphor, like a photographer who will just show you 1,000 pictures and say choose the 2 that's going to go into the art gallery, because the photographer doesn't know, they really can't see which ones have the punctum, as Bart would call it, which are the ones that really pushes you and pierces you. And so we were always kind of that with each other too. And I think that's one reason why Nimrods works in a way that I don't fully understand. And Landbridge also works in a way I don't fully understand. I think it really took that collaboration of just trusting each other for it to work that way.
Thank you, Chris. I'd love to end just right there, if that is okay. Thank you first, Chris, for speaking. Pardon me, Kawika, for speaking about your own work and also about Y-Dang's. I want to invite you all to mingle, eat, and drink. Buy both the books here. Buy Nimrods right now, but. Are there any left of Landbridge?
Oh, Landbridge, yes, right.
Okay, good, yeah. Get the book. Oh my God. So join me in thanking Kawika for.
David and buy David's books too.